Welcome, everyone. I'm Arielle Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation, and I'm so glad that you're all here with us this evening. Just a quick bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, culture, and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. I have a little bit more to tell you about this evening's talk, but we're going to take a special moment to welcome my wonderful colleague, Linnell, who's here to tell us about Village Voices, of which tonight's event is a part. Linnell, hello.
Hi, Arielle. It's nice to see you. I'm good.
It's nice to see you too.
Thank you for having me tonight. And I'm so excited that Dr. Imani Perry is with us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Perry, Imani. Just to let you all know, I feel sure many of you by now know about Village Voices, but it's our first foray into a real public art exhibition. This was a project that was conceived by our amazing trustee, Leslie Mason. And she told me about what she had dreamed up, and I was like, I'm all in, let's do this thing. And so we took it upon ourselves, and we had help from all kinds of people, incredible help from all kinds of people. It is a walking exhibition outdoors for the public. It's a gift to the public. And it's 21 exhibits throughout our neighborhoods of people and places that made a huge difference in our world, both literary and in civic activism. And you can go to each of these beautiful shadow boxes, and they're spread out through our neighborhoods, the East Village, Greenwich Village, and NoHo. And you can view these beautiful shadow boxes. Two of the exhibits are actually in virtual reality, augmented reality, so that's kind of cool too, as an extra side bonus. But the shadow boxes are spread throughout. Arielle just showed you the in the chat, she put the link for this, and you can find the map on our website. And I believe, Arielle, did you put that we have also a mobile link? Did you put that mobile link in there? If not, I'll put it in the chat after I finish talking. There's a mobile link. You can take your phone and you can listen to all of the audio components of these exhibits. So they give you more in-depth kind of value to it, and I won't give away the surprise at the end of the narration or what happens with the Lorraine Hansberry shadow box. You'll have to go and see it for yourself and listen for yourself, because it's super cool. They're two great surprises. But Lorraine Hansberry is one of the subjects of Village Voices, and we hope you will all go and see them and enjoy them. Bring your friends, bring your children. If you have children, bring your grandchildren. If you have those, bring your dog, bring your cat, because they're really amazing. They're mostly designed by the designer Penny Hardy of PS New York. The sound was designed by Surge Audio, also of New York. And we're just exceedingly proud of it. There was a great article in the New York Times last Friday, which highlighted everything about it. It was a huge, beautiful spread. We're thrilled. And New York One is going to, Roger Clark of New York One is going to talk about it on Monday. So tune in to Roger Clark. He's a great guy. Let's see, what else can I tell you about it? Arielle, do you have any questions for me before we give it over to Dr. Perry?
I don't think so. It's just so amazing.
It's so exciting.
Yeah. And so when you're walking around the village, if you see an orange box, that's what this is. And the QR code, right?
Yeah, the QR code.
Right.
Yeah. So they all have a QR code on them, and you just put your phone up there and go to and click on the thing that appears at the top of your mobile phone, and it will take you to a whole world of wonderful things.
So amazing. Well, no, thank you so much.
Thank
We're
you
so
so much.
excited.
Yeah, thanks, Ariel, for hosting this. And thanks, Dr. Perry. We're so grateful to you.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for taking that detour with us. So for our talk for this evening, we have just a little bit of Zoom protocol. I won't be visible during the talk, but I'll be here. So please feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell us where you're joining from, or to raise any issues or thoughts. If you do have questions for our speaker specifically, please just use the Q&A function. It helps me to keep track of them. You can do that at any point during the talk, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I am very delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Imani Perry is a scholar of law, literary and cultural studies, and an author of creative nonfiction. She is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Her writing and scholarship primarily focus on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination crafted in response to and resistance against the social, political, and legal realities of domination in the West. Dr. Perry's many books including Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, have received numerous awards and nominations. Her future planned projects include a new book taking readers on a narrative journey through the American South's heartlands, as well as other research initiatives which examine African American theories of law and justice and meditate on the color blue in Black life. She earned her PhD in American Studies from Harvard University, a JD from Harvard Law School, an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center, and a BA from Yale College in Literature and American Studies. Imani, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn this evening over to you. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was saying thank you so much, Ariel, for that lovely introduction. It's great to be in sort of virtual conversation with everyone, and I hope that I'm going to talk for a while, and then I hope we can have some discussion, some dialogue. It's really quite profound for me every time I have an opportunity to talk about Lorraine Hansberry. She is not just a subject of research for me, but a muse, an inspiration, a person for who changed my life. And when I decided to write this biography of her, it's a kind of an experimental biography. One of the ways I've described it is a third person memoir, in that I was sort of trying to pull the threads of her life that I thought were really significant out and find inspiration in her. I'll just say, before I get into the meat of the talk really briefly, is that, Hansberry is probably the most widely read and produced Black playwright in American history. Maybe August Wilson has come close, but in terms of all of the levels of production and reading, from middle school through adulthood, and yet until recently, with Looking for Lorraine, but also Tracy Heather Strain's documentary Sighted Eyes, Feeling Heart, and Soyika Colbert's Radical Vision. Till recently, there wasn't a picture of her life, right? She'd had this remarkable success with the Raisin in the Sun. She died at 34, and she sort of receded into the background of American history. So I wanted at first to bring her to the fore, but then as I was researching her life, I was like, it's not just that I want her to become this iconic, recognized figure. I wanted her life to be a way for readers to imagine their own lives, to be inspired, to be challenged. And I certainly, she did that for me. So one of the ways that I approached thinking about the story of her life was actually moving through the spaces she moved. So I would spend days walking the streets she once walked in Chicago, in Harlem, and certainly in the Village. and even in Croton-on-Hudson, where she lived later, and Wisconsin. And in each place, part of what I tried to do was excite my imagination by seeing that which was still there and that which wasn't there, right? So in the way that I would do that is I would pull up photographs, right? I tried to see what once was that is underneath what is now. And so it's part of why I'm so delighted to speak to you all, because this is an institution that sort of values and recognizes the importance of what was, and tending to that and caring for that. And that's a kind of exercise of honoring, but it's also a way of contemplating what uses we put to history. Why do we tell the stories we tell, right? So at any rate, this remarkable night in my life, I received a Bograd Weld Award for biography for Looking for Lorraine, and it was totally unexpected. I almost didn't go, because I was leaving from work. I didn't have something to put on. And I just said, let me go. And I won the award, and I was over the moon. And then I walked outside on a high, and I looked out onto Washington Square Park, and that place that Lorraine encountered, right, as a 20-year-old. And I remember encountering that place around the same time, when I was 18, 19, 20, and I would just go there and hang out all day and just look at the sort of, the remarkable sort of array of human beings. And the way that it excited her imagination and had excited my own seemed to sort of dovetail in this beautifully moving moment that night. Now, when Lorraine came to New York, she had left home twice already. She'd gone from Chicago, her hometown, which she wrote about extensively, to the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And at first she was excited by Wisconsin. She was into theater and she was into painting. And then she sort of soured on it. She went to Ajijic, Mexico, where she participated in this sort of artist community, studied painting. And it was a sort of wonderful, eclectic community in this gorgeous surrounding. And yet she also, she went there in the summer. She came back to Wisconsin, and she just wasn't compelled by it. She went home briefly, and then she came to New York. And at first she took another stab at college, enrolling in courses at the New School in jewelry making, photography, short story writing, and the history of American civilization. She describes that time she spent there as sort of 2 erratic months before she dropped out of college again. And she said she was looking for an education of a different sort, and she stayed in Greenwich Village at the beginning of her time in New York, and in Washington Square Park specifically. When you think about that space, named after George Washington, that bears a quotation in the arch: "Let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can repair. The event is in the hand of God," right? And it, to a certain extent, the kind of eclectic counterculture, transformative space that the park has been, defies actually the rather narrow vision of the quote unquote founding fathers, right? And it was as though these kind of iconoclastic young people took those words to heart in a way that hardly could have been imagined by George Washington. So when Lorraine arrived, right, there were guitars and banjos and mandolins and other young artists and passionate conversationalists and seekers. There were students and dropouts and nomads of various sorts. And yet she was one of the few Black women in the midst of that scene, even though it was both one of the places that was most open at that period in 1950 in the country to interracial relationships, and also one of the most queer-friendly places in the country, even though both forms of discrimination that Lorraine experienced and lived with were not in short supply. It was as open as the world provided at that time. And so she didn't have this kind of romantic conception of the village, but she found a romance in in that space. And if we think historically, the time where she was there in the 50s, these kind of artistic movements that are now counted as among the most important of the 20th century took place there. Beat poets, abstract expressionism, folk music, right? Coffee shop culture, right? And this is the place that she first encountered in New York where she became a writer. Before, she had been primarily identified as a painter. And when she got to New York, she published her first piece, which was a poem in the leftist magazine Masses and Mainstream, titled Flag from a Kitchenette Window, that read, "Southside morning, America is crying. In our land, the paycheck taxes to somebody's government, Black boy in a window, Algiers and Salerno. The three-colored banner raised to some, anonymous freedom we decide. And on the Memorial Day, hang it from our windows and let it beat the steamy Jim Crow airs." Now, this is a poem that is about Chicago. Lorraine Hansberry came from a rather elite family. Her father Carl Hansberry was known as the Kitchenette King. He was a real estate mogul. And from the very beginning, when she leaves Chicago and she comes to New York, she really articulates this critical relationship to the source of her family's prosperity, because kitchenette apartments were these very tiny carved up units that were necessary in Chicago because most of the city was covered by racially restrictive covenants, meaning that Black people, migrants from the Deep South, couldn't live in most of Chicago. And so, though they came in great numbers from the plantation South, largely, there wasn't enough space. And so Carl Hansberry began to cut up apartments so that he could accommodate the migrants. Now, that was necessary, but Lorraine carried a deep ambivalence about that work of her father's. So she writes this poem about Chicago when she gets to New York. And that's one of the ways in which, there's this indication all throughout her career, there is a constant reference to Chicago, right? Raisin, the Sun is a distinctly Chicago play, though it takes its title from a poem called Harlem by Langston Hughes. And that's another place that Lorraine was associated with. And I just want to talk a little bit about, about Harlem, and then bring us back to the Village, because I think it's a really important site for getting a fullness of who she was, right? So Hansberry moves up from the Village to Harlem to work at Paul Robeson's newspaper, Freedom newspaper, which is a sort of Black leftist newspaper, edited by Louis Messiah. I apologize for that. I'll come back to it. I can't think of his last name. And it's this kind of rich, robust paper, and the editor tells that she is, Burnham. Apologize, a brain freeze moment. Louis Burnham refers to her as the girl who could do anything. So she starts working as a staff member, and then soon she's writing articles. She has decided that she wants to sort of publicly engage politically. So she's speaking on Speaker's Corner in Harlem, and she's living in various apartments. First, 499 West 130th, and then 504 West 143rd, Unit 6A, where she's living with Claudia Jones, who's this kind of important Caribbean Communist Party member who soon thereafter is deported from the United States. She moves to a place in the Bronx, 820 West 180th, etc. But she comes back to the Village, and she comes back to the Village in part because of a partnership that will transform her life. She meets and marries Robert Nemiroff. They meet in early 1952. They're at a protest against racially discriminatory hiring practices at NYU. He was a graduate student. He was a little bit older than her, Jewish American, native New Yorker, and in some ways different, but they also shared a set of political commitments. They shared being artistic. Bobby was a songwriter in addition, and a writer, and an activist like Lorraine. And he became something much more than a partner to her. In some ways, the romantic relationship didn't last that long. But he basically devoted his life to facilitating her genius, which was rare and extraordinary in general at that time for women, and virtually unheard of for a Black woman. At any rate, they ultimately partner and marry. But early on, there's some indication that she's not completely taken by the relationship. In a letter that she wrote on December 26th, 1952, from Chicago back to him and to Bobby in New York, she says, "Once again, I wrote you a very long letter. The important, simple things which it said were that I have finally admitted to myself I do love you, you wide-eyed, immature, unsophisticated revolutionary." And she claimed to have thrown away that sentimental piece in favor of what she describes as a breezy little missile. And there's this kind of sweetness to it, but there's a kind of unusual underpinning. And then she says about her own aspirations, like, "I am a writer. I am going to write. Any real contribution I can make to the movement can only be the result of a disciplined life. I am going to institute discipline in my life. I can paint. I am going to paint." And it's an indication, right? There's not a lot of romance, but there's a sense that this partnership can be a space for her to pursue her commitments. And their marriage was, in a sense, representative of a certain kind of life of the avant-garde in the village at that time. They're bohemians, they're an interracial couple dedicated to radical social transformation, and they lived in the village where they made art and attended protests, right? Attended protests. Art DeLugoff, who was a jazz impresario, remembered those days with Lorraine at the village gate, and she helped him put together various shows, and she was on the scene, and she said, he said she'd write leaflets, she'd type them, she'd take them around to coffee houses and then they would hang out in the restaurant owned by Bobby's parents, Potpourri, which is on Washington Place, and they bussed tables as well. And later in her life, she would go to the village gate to listen to her dear friend Nina Simone perform. Now, before the era of A Raisin in the Sun and the way that changed her life, Bobby got a job in promotions at Avon Books, and she was doing various things. She'd write for various leftist newspapers. She would run leftist summer camps and the like. But he kept doing his songwriting work. And in 1956, they decided to write a song that fit into what was called then the Calypso craze, which was sort of like these kind of relatively milquetoast versions of Calypso songs. And they took this song that was sung by dock workers on the Georgia Sea Islands, and they watered it down and they changed it into a romantic song called Cindy Oh Cindy. And then the song turned out to be a hit. And all of a sudden, these sort of bohemian artists have had a lot of money. And so Lorraine stopped working the various jobs and sat home and wrote. And that is how she wrote A Raisin in the Sun. Now, the part of the story that for me is really important, that is that to show in terms of the difference between even the rather modest account of her life and the reality, is that she wasn't with Bobby for much of the writing of A Raisin in the Sun. Lorraine was largely, her romantic life, and she had a lot of girlfriends, was largely with women and that period in the mid-1950s. Many of her partners weren't overtly political in the way Lorraine was, even about questions around feminism and sexuality. But it was a really important social world for her. But there was one woman who undoubtedly facilitated her literary ventures. She stood out amongst the others, Molly Malone Cook, who is best known probably at this point as the long-term partner of the poet Mary Oliver. And Molly was a Californian. She'd come to New York. And, one of and there's not a lot of detail about their relationship. There's a little bit in a beautiful book that Mary Oliver and Molly sort of put together. But she took these pictures, and I think that they were taken, I can't be positive, but in Molly's apartment at 46 Downing Street. And the photographs are different from all the others I've seen of Lorraine. And they tell a story in and of themselves. Lorraine doesn't have her armor on. She's not performing a particular kind of sort of defiant yet respectable kind of, black race woman presence in them. She is casual, she is informal. Her hair is mussed, her back is curved, she's languorous, she looks adolescent and playful. Her eyes have a light in them. Once you know her story and you know how both curious and hilarious she was, you just can feel so much of that coming out off the images. And Molly was a photographer, right? And was the only one, I think, who really captured this part of Lorraine. Right? The images are a dance of love. And so when I saw these photographs taken by her, I started to look at all of Molly's photography, and her pieces tend to be very dynamic and social and sensitive, as well as lively, right? And as an artist, I began to see the relationship that existed as Lorraine was writing A Raisin in the Sun, had this shared, the relationship was evident in the work that they would produce, right? So Lorraine's brilliance in part as a playwright is an attention to staging and framing and navigating both the intimate sphere, having a sensitivity to social dynamics and within an allotted space. Now, if anybody has read the body of Lorraine Hansberry's work, she is in the kind of domestic sphere by and large, right? This sort of enclosed space. And so this framing that you see in Molly's work is often, which I encourage everybody, if you're not familiar with her work, to check it out, because the work is really beautiful, but similar in sensibility. She also is very attentive to vistas, right? And you see that in both, the physical landscape of Molly's photographs and in the emotional landscape of Lorraine's work. So when Lorraine wrote stage directions, it wasn't just have this here, have that, this there. There were epigraphs and sense making and, kind of the stage directions are a world of art in and of themselves. Right? And by the time A Raisin in the Sun made its way to Broadway in 1959, Molly's relation and Lorraine Hansberry's relationship had ended, and Molly took a trip across the country, stopped to visit with Lorraine's uncle in Tennessee, and eventually would go on, to open a really important photography bookstore in Provincetown and build this extraordinary life with Mary Oliver. But her life in the village remains interesting and important to record. Her most significant relationship from 1960 until her dying day was with Dorothy Sekulas, and who was a fiercely opinionated and smart blonde who went from being a receptionist to being an executive at Loft Candy Company. There's a kind of Dorothy's youthful nickname was Dick, She had laughing eyes, and she sat at Lorraine's side in the most important moments, right? Lorraine wrote in her diary about her beauty, how desirous she was of Dorothy, the kind of excitement that she felt in her presence. And as part of their sort of choice of the way they could live together, we have to think about this as an era, right, where where gay and lesbian clubs are being raided, where people's names are being published in the paper in efforts to destroy them for being same gender loving. Lorraine bought a building at 112 Waverly Place, that's sort of her home. Dorothy was a renter, and Lorraine lived on the top floor, and that's the arrangement. Now the FBI, and I am just bringing this in, I apologize, somewhat spontaneously, but wanted to sort of focus on the geography of the neighborhood. But because of Lorraine's politics, she was on the FBI's radar from 1953, long before fame. And they had been following her. And they knew she purchased this home. They looked for Lorraine in this home. And the notes of the agent, she has a significant file, who was following her, describes having physically checked all the residences on Waverly Place from McDougal to Bank Street in a particular week, but not being able to find her. Right? So they knew this was where she was living. And then they go to visit Bobby in the other home at 337 Bleecker. And they ask him, why do you live here? And Lorraine is living on Waverly Place. And they record Bobby having said business reasons, right? So she has to be on her own in order to do her writing. And it's a consequence. She's writing now, so she couldn't talk to the agents, etc. Right? And the FBI seems to have believed this explanation. And it's really interesting because when you look at, for example, the FBI files on other prominent Black figures during that period, and in particular James Baldwin, there's this sort of deep investigation into their sexuality. And it's almost as though, because of the way they read Lorraine and her body and her presence, that they didn't sort of make a set of assumptions and actually missed her life in a way that is sort of delightful, in that she was not unmoored, and her love wasn't destroyed by virtue of their surveillance. Now, in her date book, on the very same week when the FBI is going back and forth checking all the residences looking for her, she wrote to herself, "Are you happy in your present living? Or are you looking for something else? Or do you just want to play? You see, I must know because it is spring. Have toys, we'll play. I wish to light up the stars again." So it's opaque, but it's a sort of characteristic yearning that Lorraine would always hold on to. And I think one of the things that is missed about her yearning is how much of it is a longing for a world in which she could be more fully. And it's sort of, there's these moments that are so instructive as to how how often she was misread. So a different FBI agent described her as a few years earlier as 5'4", 105 pounds, Negro, Italian haircut, no glasses, light brown, yellow shirt, and black toreadors, right? Every account would talk about her beauty and often describe her as a sort of ingenue, and in fact, she was this kind of fierce, courageous figure. And courageous, I think, in multiple ways. She was unflinching in her critique of racial domination in society. She was outspoken even after her fame, which could put a wrench in the works of the celebration of her and the recognition of her fame. And also, she was a person who, and this is, I think, for me, sort of one of the most important points about her life in the Village, is that she, being in a place where the possibility of, and Lorraine identified very explicitly, I should say, as a lesbian. That was the term for her identification. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about her histories is, so she wasn't out publicly, but it was an important political and social identity for her. And she was very close to James Baldwin, who actually had an aversion to being identified as gay and as part of a gay rights movement. And really, I mean, I think now in retrospect, we can read him as being identified in the category of queer, which wasn't sort of quite available in the same way back then. But in that, you know, he say, well, if you fall in love with a woman, you fall in love with women, you fall in love with a boy, you fall in love with a boy. I don't want to see this as political identity. It was very much so a political identity for Lorraine. And that was possible. And she talked about this, you know, by virtue of being on the streets of the Village. It was available to her. And then it makes that reality, the sense of possibility, the sense of sort of trying to think about, what does this mean in terms of gender? What does this mean in terms of ideals of freedom, made its way into her work. And I just want to, I've gone on some time, but I just want to give two examples, because A Raisin in the Sun is like always up somewhere. Two of her other full-length plays, Le Blanc and The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, are very rarely produced. And they're both really interesting, in part because what they do is they integrate thought about race and gender and sexuality in a variety of ways. So just say quickly about Le Blanc, right? So Le Blanc, much of that play, which is a sort of one of the early plays that imagines kind of the moment of revolution in anti-colonial movements in an African nation. And in that play, there are three brothers. And one is a Christian, and one is an expatriate who's coming back home to be involved extensively. And one is a biracial son who is the product of a sexual assault of their mother experienced from a European man. And he's the one who has been in Africa the whole time. Now, the eldest brother, Tshimbe, is much of the play as he's arguing with with the white settler, and over politics and race, etc. And he's the eldest brother, Tshimbe, is often frustrated with the Christian, but they both have a kind of cruelty towards the youngest brother, Eric, who is mixed race, and is but he's the only one of the three who has no hesitation about joining the resistance, who really wants to fight for African liberation. And they mock him and they say, you're half European, which part of yourself will you drive into the sea? And then they refer to him as someone who wants to become a white woman because he's having a relationship with a white man who is a settler. And so what, in the choice that Lorraine makes to make Eric the one who most deeply invests in the revolution, and to be the one, the brother who is marked as queer and the site of transformative possibility at the same time, is not an inconsequential decision. And it's very clearly, to me, a decision that comes from the world she was able to occupy. Similarly, but less hopefully, in The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, is that you have all these characters, women, three sisters, a queer white man, a black man, in this apartment together, and every single character finds themselves in some way limited by the operation of, what we now call, heteropatriarchal capitalist ideologies. And so she stages something, an encounter across identities of the sort that we don't even begin to see in a really significant way until the 21st century. And so all of that to say, when I say that place is important, and when I say that the village is important in Lorraine's story, I'm saying that it is important both for, it was an experience, it's where she lived, it's where she partnered, but it was also a place that ignited her imagination. And I think that's probably the same for many of us. And so, it's just such a delight, even now after the work, to be there and to feel it. And I can't wait to see the installation. And with that, I will cease talking. Thank you.
Thank you so, so much. Everyone, now is a great time to submit questions in the Q&A. I've got a few too. And Marcia wanted to know, what year did Lorraine arrive in Washington Square Park?
Oh, 1950.
1950, thanks. Also, hi, Marcia. I'm curious about, actually about Lorraine's death, just because it seemed to me like she wrote about every single experience that she ever had. Did she face her death? Did she write about it?
That's a great question. So yes, although as was common, in 1965, she was not told until the very end that she was dying.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so the theory was, especially with cancer patients, that if you told them they were dying, it would hasten their death. And so she was told various things. She had ulcers and she would get various treatments. And so, to read her diaries is something really harrowing because you can tell she knows that something is very wrong, but she doesn't know what it is. And this is, it's really devastating. It's just a period where she's blind, and she is very clear she doesn't want to die. And it's also, there's another layer of this, is that whatever the situation was, Dorothy at various times felt like she couldn't access Lorraine as she was on her deathbed. And so, so it was, but, her friends would stand outside the hospital and on the sidewalk and wave up to her. And she kept going to rehearsals for the sign of Sidney Brewstein's window. And so, I'll just say for me, it's really important to recount this part of the story, because for those of us who live with disability and with terminal illness, this incredibly lonely and isolating experience is actually something that's so universal, and to give us, as readers, the opportunity for that to resonate, and also experience how miraculous and beautiful her life was, notwithstanding how hard the end was. Yeah, it was important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. I'm curious also about the protests that they were a part of. What were the movements that were happening? What were they up to?
So rent strikes, protests at the UN, of course, things that are civil rights related. They varied. Even Lorraine had, there's several letters where she writes to her neighbors where she's talking about the racism towards Black people when they come into the village. She just sort of, and then something changes, and a lot of it is international, right? So it'll, it's about what's happening in Latin America and the kind of, but once the sort of Southern civil rights movement is in full force, she really shifts her attention. Like I should say, like Lorraine Hansberry is not that interested when Brown versus Board of Education is, because for her, she grew up in Chicago and she's like, okay, it wasn't legally, their schools weren't legally segregated, but it was absolutely segregated, right? And yeah, so whatever. But then when she sees what the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is doing, she's excited and begins to invest in that organizing. And it's one of the pictures on Washington Square Park of her wearing this sort of beautiful black PK dress with pearls is actually a civil rights protest. And
Yeah.
yeah,
so that's the image that we used for this event. I mean, she looks incredible.
Yeah. I'll just say really quickly, just as again, it's sort of one of these like kismet moments when, you know, she also had a fundraiser up in Croton-on-Hudson where she had a second home, a third home. She had a couple of homes, but and they raised money for CORE, and the CORE bought a car with it, and that was the car that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were driving when they were murdered by the Klan in Mississippi.
Wow.
Very immediate, right? And in her papers, the communications with members of SNCC are really quite profound. Yeah.
Wow, that is really incredible. I mean,
Crossroads.
Sorry, say that again.
At the crossroads of so much, you know.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question from Mary. How were her two her two non-Raisin in the Sun plays, how were they received?
So that's a great question. So I'll say the Simon Sidney Brustein's Window was very hard to raise money for, and it went down the day she died off Broadway. And there were a lot of different critiques of it. One was people really wanted her to write the same kind of play. There were people who didn't like, they called it a white play because her characters were mostly white. It was her village play. It was her play that depicted her community, right?
Yeah.
But there were a lot of people who had difficulty with that. I also think that it was misunderstood. In some ways it was before its time. The play is a lot about the power of patriarchy. It is in a way that I don't know that audiences of the time could really get, and the way that it operates in people's minds, right? And the listening, it's this motif of like the pressure of the father's voice. Right? So I think LeBlanc was never produced. It has been described, I mean, that's not true. It was never produced during her lifetime. It is technically unfinished, I would say, and I wrote this, and there are different opinions on this, but having read through all of the versions, I consider it to be a finished play. It's extraordinary. That has had mixed reviews. Some people say that because Bobby put together the last production, they just off the surface say, oh, it's not her work, and so just responded negatively because of that. But others, and I think they're right, this is a really important anti-colonial play, right? This is before Ethel Fugard and before Wole Soyinka's public, like it's in some ways anticipating what's coming in post-colonial African theater. And she's, from Chicago. Yeah.
You made me think of Virginia Woolf also, just like
yes.
Yeah. Okay, more questions from Susan. Hi, Susan. Did she live on Waverly Place all her life in the Village? If not, where? And is there a plaque? She was on Bleecker Street, right?
Yeah. And I don't actually know, I could find it, but the address when she first moves to the Village, that I don't have off the top of my head. It may be in Soyika's book, though.
And I know that there's not a plaque on Bleecker Street, but there is on Waverly. Okay, let's see. Oh, hi everybody. Everybody's showing up. I love this. Okay, great. Leslie Mason wants to first say thank you very much for recording the introduction to Lorraine for Village Voices. Everybody check it out. And she wants to know, and actually this was one of my questions as well, which is, well, I'll read it from Leslie. Do you feel we should acknowledge her sexuality in a more straightforward manner?
Yes.
And I mean, this is something that I think about a lot when she's called the first Black woman playwright to, have a show on Broadway. I'm always like, well, if we're going by representation and identity.
Yeah. I mean, I think on a certain level, though, it's hard to know, right, who is the first queer woman, lesbian, right? Because we don't know, right? That's the tricky part. But I do think it's important. And I got this question a lot. And this is why I wrote in a straightforward way about her sexuality, because it was part of her identity, because you can't understand the full body of her work, I think, without it as an album. And also there's a very, when you go into the archives, there's a folder called the Emily Jones folder, right? That was preserved, which is all of her kind of overtly feminist lesbian writing, right? Things that she wrote under the pseudonym Emily Jones. That was kept for, like, it is very clearly cherished. Not only that, but after she dies, Bobby is writing girlfriends from other stages of her life and saying, would you be willing to share your communication with Lorraine? So this is,
oh, wow,
was deliberately preserved, right? This is part of her story.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question, right? I know there are other people who have sort of, I think, hesitated on the issue. And I'll just say the last thing, it's too important. It's too important for young people to not make this a central part of how we tell her story.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Thank you for that. I really appreciate that. Leslie is also wondering, at her memorial, were the loves in her lives acknowledged? Was Dorothy acknowledged? How did that go?
Yeah. So yes, some amongst the formal pallbearers. I mean, I don't think they actually. There's not in the program, but there's this really interesting tidbit. So after her death, they make the announcement in Jet magazine, which is like the most important Black weekly in the country. And they say, Lorraine Hansberry got divorced, like right before she died, and she left all this money to Dorothy Sekulis, right? And so it's not overt, but it's very, it's a real, especially if you think about 1965, there's something very deliberate about putting that in the notice in that magazine. Mm-hmm. So there's indications. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Lisa wants to know, how did Raisin get produced on Broadway? What's the story?
Yeah, so they had it's the story is a spaghetti dinner sort of where she's with the producer, and she shares the draft, and then they Suskind, and then they are trying. So then they start trying to raise money, because people are excited about it, and it's very hard because there just hasn't been a play like this with Black people. Like, there's no evidence that an audience wants to see like Black people not singing and dancing on Broadway. There's no track record. And so they get a lot of investors, and they do trials in Philadelphia, and I'm trying to think of the other city. I think it might be Baltimore. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they do these trial runs, and they get this wonderful response. And so it's a extended process of getting to Broadway. And then the sort of remarkable thing, and James Baldwin writes about this, is that all these Black people come to Broadway. And he asks one of the theater goers, like, it's expensive, right? And Black New Yorkers are poor by and large. And he asks somebody, why are you doing this and coming here? And this woman says to him, well, I heard there was something happening here that has something to do with me. And it's sort of one of the first times you get this broadening audience. And this shows there is a desire for in Black theater, which is, you know, in this season is sort of an interesting thing to reflect on that, because we're at a moment where there's some more opening up that's happening. You know, as I don't know, we're not post-COVID, but as COVID recedes or something, right? That, you know, this question of who does the theater belong to? So she's really like she opens that door. She just does, you know.
Pretty amazing. Yeah. All right. Lydia says, thank you so much for your work. Can you please touch on her, Baldwin, and there were others who met with RFK in 1963. Lydia says, I understand that she cracked Kennedy like a nut.
That'd be that description. Yeah. So okay. So it's early spring 1963, and Robert F. Kennedy asks Baldwin to bring his friends to talk about the race issue. Now, the immediate concern is really Black people in my hometown of Birmingham, Alabama, where I was born, are protesting very strongly. Right, this is now, and the Kennedys are worried that it will be bad for their party politics, and so the idea is to bring these famous Black people to tell other Black people to calm down, like especially the Black people in the South, which of course Lorraine would not be a fan of, right? So, you know, the meeting starts off. So there's Lena Horne is there, Rip Torn is there, various figures, some famous and some not, are present. And the meeting is really sort of calmed down. And at some point, there's a worker from CORE who speaks up and is basically expresses his outrage, having come, you know, it's important. He's in New York because he's had to have surgery because he was beaten so badly by white supremacists in the Deep South, and is a person who has experienced firsthand how the Kennedy administration had been failing to protect Black protest organizers, civil rights organizers. So, you know, and now we have it, it's very clear in history, but they just let them be brutalized, essentially. So he speaks up in outrage, and RFK kind of ignores him, like, sort of like, you're not famous, you know, you're just a sort of civil rights worker in some overalls. And this incenses Lorraine. And so she is like, that's the person you're supposed to be speaking to, but also flips the whole conversation. And you know, and there's other people too, like Lena Horne is like, if you think she says, you know, you're a fool if you think I'm going to tell Black people what to do in Alabama. But Lorraine really sets the tone in saying, no, we want a moral commitment from you in support of the people who are on the front lines of the civil rights struggle. And then she stands up and Baldwin describes her as like seeming like a giant. She was tiny, but it's like she was like a giant in the meeting. And then you know, she stands up and walks out, and they follow her. And it's reported in the New York Times the meeting was a failure. So this is like a media. It's not the media isn't inside, but it's a media event. But it changes the language of the Kennedy administration. They start talking about using Lorraine's language, a moral commitment to civil rights. And the last thing I'll say about that moment that was so powerful to me is that, so she walks out. Baldwin is in a car with the guy, the psychologist who did this doll studies for Brownview. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. This is like age. I keep losing the names. He's in a car and he sees Lorraine. She doesn't see him, and she's holding her stomach. So she's already sick at that moment. And so it's all, there's another level of power in that moment when you know she was in pain, right? But that's who she was, and she did. You know, it changed the tenor of the administration, but I think it also changed this idea that Black celebrities would quell protests as opposed to see themselves as being in service of the movement.
And there's something so powerful too about just walking out of the room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
do that.
really, really great. Um, Lydia also wanted to know, did Hansberry intersect at all with Audre Lorde?
That I couldn't find. I'm not saying she didn't. There's a club, like, oh gosh, and that's another name again. There's a club that I know Audre Lorde frequented that was near Lorraine's apartment. So I think that's a good chance they ran into each other there.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know for sure.
Lisa, if you remember the name of that bar that we saw that Jay and Ken told us about on Tuesday, put it in the chat. I can't remember the name of it, but I remember hearing about it.
Interracial lesbian bar in the village at the time. Yeah, I can't. Yeah. So
I'll find it. I always send out an email after our events with lots of links in it. So I will find it and I will include this in our follow-up email. So let's see. We also have, okay, Eric wants to know, could you talk about the impact that the cultural environment of the village and also Harlem had on Lorraine's development as an artist?
yeah.
He's citing Bob Dylan, who, it's just like right place, right time kind of deal. How old was she when she arrived, and what were some of the currents that she was soaking up?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, she's 20 years old, and absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting because she was now Lorraine was very, very critical of the Beats, right? Like she did not like sort of
Oh,
let's
white.
yeah, and then this feeling that there was like this romanticized vision of blackness, and she would write things like, you don't even know like how much black people can't stand this depiction. Like black people are really like socially conservative and oh yeah, there we go. The pony stable. And so but she's an artist. She loves music. She loves folk music. She loves traditional ethnic music. Sort of like, Eastern European Jewish music and the like. And so it is an inspiration. And I think, so that's one. I think the village was probably much more direct artistic inspiration. I think Harlem was very much overtly political. Like, so this is still, even though the sort of heyday of Black radicalism had ceased, there's still people there, right? So she's mentored by W.E.B. Du Bois. She's mentored by Paul Robeson. There's this whole like community, and also theater world, right? So there's the Black, the Black theater world that remains after the WPA era. That was, all of these Black theaters were established in the midst of the Depression in response to the Communist Party's Cultural Front, where they created all these Black artistic and theater groups. So the United States government creates an alternative version as part of the Cold War politics. So there's a whole world of people in Harlem, Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee, et cetera, who are involved, who mentor her in the theater world. So there's like the music, visual culture in the village, is a theater world, and the politics in Harlem. And then there's the young sort of leftists around NYU and the New School. So there's, really powerful influence, I think. Yeah. Although, Lorraine was ornery. Like she was hypercritical of a lot of stuff. So, you don't necessarily get the sort of tender hand with all of but it's clearly there. Yeah.
Good reason, I think. Deborah James is asking, in looking for Lorraine, you reference a disagreement between Sidney Poitier and Lorraine Hansberry during the making of the Raisin in the Sun film. Did their differences involve Hansberry's struggle with Columbia Pictures over its rejection of her screenplays as too controversial?
No, as far as I know, it's really his politics. And, as compared, I mean, you can sort of see it in the bifurcation of Poitier's career with Belafonte's, for example, and she remained closer to Belafonte, that Poitier's strategy of navigating Hollywood was to not ruffle feathers. And he and as a consequence, he made some extraordinarily important films. So, there's you could see the point of the strategy, but it just really infuriated her. She thought he was too, milk toast and not outspoken about civil rights, having come from, in his early days, being very politically engaged. So it was a shift. So when she says what happened to Sidney Poitier, she's talking about his political shift.
Thanks. Kathy wants to know, what type of painting did Lorraine do? Are any of her paintings available to be seen?
So no, I'm hoping, the Lorraine Hansberry Literary Trust on their website has some images. She did self-portraits, and those are mostly drawings. And I one of the things I think is interesting is her head is always really big in her self-portraits, which I think is like how intensely cerebral she was when she was a voracious reader, and she would read works of political theory, and she'd be like, I'm trying to reconcile, Veblen with Marx on this point. She's really as much an intellectual as she was an artist. So that, I think, is why her head is so big in her self-portraits. And she did mostly women, line drawings sometimes, a lot of heads down, eyes half closed. Yeah, but I think I am sure that the trust has many more of her works in the archive. I would love, that's one of my fantasies, I would love to curate a show of her visual art. I mean, it just would be heavenly. And she thought she was good.
Hope that can happen. Let's all manifest that for you. I have two more questions. The first, I read this very amazing letter that she wrote in the Ladder about marriage. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about her decision to sort of keep her relationship with her husband. And, she talks in this letter about how, sort of in the same way, like, what are the moral obligations of this? How do we be honest as women who love women with our husbands? All of these things. And her decision to not pursue divorce or to, continue that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, so, they're not, I guess it's less than 5 years. They're not living together anymore. He knew that, that she loved women. And tried to sort of, he really then becomes like someone who facilitates her work, right? After her death. It's complicated, right? There are friends and women who she'd had relationships with who describe him as having been an impediment, because of his, so there's not secret, there's not like, it's not like that's still a romantic relationship, but he very clearly loved Lorraine and had some sense of maybe possessiveness over Lorraine that made it hard for her to have kind of really completely actualized relationships, because he was there presented as the husband, right? And I think it's also interesting, there's an indication that even the choice to get married at all was more than anything about appeasing her family. They're like, what are you doing as this single young woman in New York? You need to, so they're kind of like a social conservatism about marriage. And I think what's interesting about Lorraine is that she talked in this letter and then also personal notes about the institution of marriage, both for women who love women, but also just in general, it's kind of the burden of this patriarchal institution and, what it foreclosed. And so she really is one of the early people who very explicitly ties feminist politics to her sexuality. She loves Simone de Beauvoir. And so she's reading her constantly and thinking about how, but she's like, it's conversation in conversation. Like if anybody ever want to write, you could write a whole book about her margin comments in The Second Sex, right? Like, cause it's a conversation, like it's a debate. And there are moments where she's like, railing at de Beauvoir for being critical of women liking to like dress up. And she's like, I can tell she liked dressing up too, like, so she's really, and also just about the ideas and how race changes some of the thoughts. So, so the letter, letters to the ladder, and then the short stories that she wrote for both the ladder and one are really important. I really want those published in a way that's widely accessible, because it's also a different kind of writing. There's a tenderness, there's a lyricism that's not, that is different from her other writings. Right?
Yeah, and in the letters, it's just like so intellectual, just like arguing for intellectualism. I really appreciated that. And just my last question is, the New York Times published today this amazing article about the African Grove Theater, which also lived in our neighborhoods in the mid 1800s as sort of the first Black theater, and it referenced that Broadway is reopening, as you mentioned, and all of the plays are by Black playwrights. And I wonder if you have any thoughts or recommendations about folks who you think are sort of especially continuing her legacy in Black theater.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I think, for so long, and, I think someone like Lynn Nottage, Erica Dickerson, I think, but I also, it's interesting because her legacy is so varied, right? And so I think sometimes even playwrights who don't think that they are directly influenced by, like August Wilson was so not, it's heartbreaking because I love August Wilson, but he was not cool to Lorraine Hansberry, even though in many ways he's sort of rewriting the things that she staged. And that was because he was like in the kind of Amiri Baraka camp when they were criticizing Hansberry. And then even Amiri Baraka changes his mind. He's like, I was completely wrong about how I described her. So, but I will say something about just what you described and these works that are coming out, and then also the history. Like I'll say even this, so Christopher Street in the 90s looked very different than it does now, right? There are always these sort of cycles, right, of presence and absence that are usually shaped by either politics or the economy, right? And I just think the work of recounting history and like naming what was and why it was important and how it shaped where we are now is an important practice, because I think it gives us a lens that helps us figure out how to operate in a more just way today, right, as we move forward. And I think that's the thing that Lorraine, when I feel her, and I feel her presence all the time. Like I've seen the name Lorraine in all these places. Like, my DoorDash deliverer was named Lorraine. Like I see, pictures coming up. It's like all this stuff. And anyway, see if Perry, her mother's family are Perrys from Tennessee. Not related to me, but when I see Perry's from Tennessee, I'm like, oh, that's a message from Lorraine. But I think that's in some ways that's the message, right? Is of this, the important work that you all do, but also that we're all called to do, which is to not just let the stories disappear, to hold on, to keep track, and it helps us be more ethical to the people in our presence now.
Yeah, I definitely see that as part of our organizational and personal mandates. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has just been a dream of a program. I'm so, so delighted to have you. And thank you all who are still here with us. Thanks to everyone who came. Stay safe, stay healthy, keep reading. Have a sweet evening, everyone. Take good care. Bye.